Alright, so we were down to the machlekes in the Ori Mekubalim, B'inyan Madregas HaKeser. And we saw that there were two opinions. There was the opinion of many of the great Mekubalim that the Madregas HaKeser is not one of the Esesphiras b'minyan. It's not counted in the minyan of the Esesphiras, and that means that it's a madrega l'mayla mi Eser HaSphiras. Ve'ilu, we saw that the Ramak, the Rabbeinu Moshe Kadavira, he's of the opinion in the Sefer HaPardes, he's of the opinion that the Keser is counted and is in effect one of the Esesphiras. So in order to explain that machlekes, we began first of all with the those who don't agree with the Ramak, or those who Al Kaponim stated their case prior to the Ramak, and they held that the special Maila that there is in Keser is that it's not what we called Mechudash. So you know the point we made earlier in the Maimah is that the B'midah Mesuyemes, everything is Mechudash, in the sense that it came and it was Meir from the Atzmos, and therefore Yesh Lazeh Tchila. Mashenkin only in Atzmos' Bora can we say that Ein Loi Tchila, he doesn't have the Inyan from Tchila. However, the word we saw Mechudash is connected with the Inyan of Yesh Mi Ayin, that even though there are many madregas in Yesh Mi Ayin, we saw that the concept of Mechudash means where there comes about a entity, B'derech Gvul, V'mido, or Al Kaponim in a specific oifen, which can be seen, even though it may not be mamish in all aspects, but it can be seen as a bifnei atzmei, apart from the pshitas ha'atzmas. And when it's called a ha'inyan, which came about in a specific limited entity, apart from the atzmas, and that's called yesh mino ayin. Therefore, even the kelim in Olam HaAtzilas are also called yesh mino ayin b'inyan zeh. And we see later we'll meet with the Amitius in Yesh Mi'ayin is only in Olam Bria Yetzirah V'Asiyah after Malchus Ta'atzilas. But relatively speaking, and Legabi the Pshitas of the Atzmas, Be'amitius Ador, then there is Yesh Mi'ayin Afilu L'mayla Mi'atzilas. Therefore, they hold that the Inyan from Keser are the great Madrega HaMiyuchedes, the Ilui Miyuchad, in the Keser is that Ein B'zeh, it's not Ein B'zeh Inyan Shal Mechudash. And we brought a right to that from the fact, we quoted from the Zohar that the Keser doesn't have in itself the Inyan of Kelim. Even though the truth is that there's a certain Mokir in Keser for the Inyan Oisias, what they later become the Inyan from Kelim, or the other way around, there's a certain Madrega for Kelim, which later become Oisias, but that's in a very high Madrega where it's not really in an identifiable state yet, it's only a potential. That's what the Alter Rebbe talks about in Parsha B'Chukaysai, that's what we call the Eises HaChakiko, where there was a mile of the Luchas Rishonos, with a whole big Arichas Hadvarim. So we saw that was the Shitta of those Mekubalim, and then the Rebbe added that according to the Bia in the previous Maimah, here in this Hemshah we could even say that not only the Kelim are in Yesh Mi'ayin, but even the Oiros Shebeha Kelim in the Esesphiras, even they can be called Yesh Mi'ayin. They brought a dug from the Inyan from Chochmah, that if we say the Chochmah, Legabi the Emes ain't safe, not Legabi the Kav, but Legabi the Emes ain't safe, is Yesh Mi'ayin, then Lechera Chochmah includes also the Oyer. So we see that any Oyer which is Meir for the sake of a specific entity, even though it may have in itself certain milas Legabi that specific entity, is also Niklal in the concept of Legabi the Pshitas and the absolute the transcendency of Lamaila Miaspheres, and that's also called Yesh Mi'ayin. That was the Chiddush that the Rabbi made here. And therefore we saw that that was the, as it were, the Chesaron in the whole Inyan of the Esser Spheres. Ma'ashenkein, the Inyan from Keser, Hu Am Shochesh B'chinas Ein Seif, it's a Gilui which is still absolutely unlimited and doesn't have any aspect of Mechudash, Be'yesh Mi'ayin in it. And we saw that Al Zeh, Omer Razal, and we quoted the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, Ad Shalei Nivra Ha'olam. And Ad Shalei Nivra Ha'olam here means until the Gilui of Elam Ha'atzilas. Ad Shalei Nivra Ha'olam, up until the Gilui of Atzilas. Because as we say, we're dealing here with a relative Yesh Mi'ayin, and we're calling even Atzilas Nivra B'derech Yesh Mi'ayin. Hoyehu Ushmoi Bil Bar. What Hu, in simple terms, refers to the Eibishter Kamoishahu, the Eibishter Batzmusei, Ushmoi, prior to the whole Inyan of Gilui Esser HaSpheres, and the whole beginning of what eventually leads to the Inyan HaOilam in a state of Nivra Kipshute, well, that's the Gilui of the Esser Spheres, then the Eibishter was Kilo Hu, and he was also together with, or there was also a Gilui from him of Shmoi, Hu Ushmoi. But they were in a state of Bilvad, they were still completely withdrawn from any contact or kesher with what later becomes the Mechudashim, the Inyan of the Esser Spirit. So we see then that in Cain there's two Madrega, two Inyonim, can't really call them Madregas, but two Inyonim, prior to the Iskalas of the Esser Spheres, Hu Ushmoi. So that Inyan of Hu can be taken as referring to something Atzmi, maybe even the Atzmis himself, and then there's Shmoi, literally his name. So we see that there's a Madrega between the Atzmis and the Esser Spheres, which is called Shmoi. And so that's what we want to suggest. Well, that's the Inyan of Ein Seif Bentayim. It's still Ein Seif. It's not the Inyan of the Nivra Ha'elam of the Esser Spheres, and yet nonetheless it's not Mamish Atzmusei's Bora. So that's what we'll call Keser. That we give the name according to these Mukubolim, but that's what we give the name Keser. So therefore he says, Ad Shaloi Nivra Ha'elam Hu Ushmoi Bilvad, Shebchina Shmoi, Shahoyo Gam Kein Ad Shaloi Nivra Ha'elam Atzilus. What he teaches clearly that when we say Nivra Ha'elam, we mean the appearance of the Esser Spheres Atzilus. Hainu B'chinas HaKeser. And what sort of Madrega would that be? Well, that's what they call the Inyan of Keser, V'hu Anikra Ein Seif, and that's what's called Ein Seif. Uli Divrei Moshe Shapir, and that, according to their words, everything goes good. Shenikra Ein Seif, Loi Nikra Ein Loi Tchila. Now we'll know why it's called, the Keser is called Ein Seif, and it's not called Ein Loi Tchila. Sha'arei Be'emes Yesh Loi Tchila. The Keser, which is the Ein Seif, this Madrega which is Ein Mechudas, Lamaila Miaspheres, it does have a Tchila. Hu Baal Hashem. That's the, literally Kaviyol, the possessor of the name. In other words, the Etzem Eibishter himself. He's the one who is beyond everything. The one that is the Yeshloi Tchila. I'm sorry, the one that is the Tchila of the Ein Seif, that's the Baal Hashem. Ukamayim Razal, Hu, Ushmoi. There was a Madrega of Hu, and there was Shmoi. Ma'ashenkein, Mohusi Vatzmusei, Lo Shaya Klal Likreisei Ein Seif Kanal. Ma'ashenkein, that Baal Hashem, which is a Mohusi Vatzmusei, that you can't call him Ein Seif, but you can only call him Ein Loi Tchila. But he is the owner of the Ein Seif. In other words, he's the owner or the possessor of the name, and that name is called Ein Seif, and that is an intermediary point between Atzmusei and Mehusei and the Esser Spheres, what they are Mechudashim. And that's what we call Keser. That's the Madrega that we give the name Keser, and that's also called Ein Sof. And it's called Ein Sof because Ein Hanami, it has no Sof, and it's Beligvul, and it's Betachas Sapshitas, but it's not Ein Loita Tchila, it's not Mamishat Musa. So they have a good case, these Mukubarim, but that's their Shitta, and that's what they call Keser. And Imta, that's Nirmas in the statement of Rabbi Eliezer, that there was Hu, and then there was Shmoi, and then there was Niraha, and Shmoi is the Inyan of Keser. And so that also makes good sense, in other places, Barichas, etc., why we say that Shmoi would be Keser, or why Shmoi would be this intermediary point between the Atzmus and the Nivro, the actual creator, even though the spheres are not Nivroim, but they're relatively Nivro, because we see that the Shem of a mensch, Shmoi, Shel HaAdam, is not the Etzem of the Adam, it's by no means his essence, and yet it's very profoundly connected with his essence, that when you call a person by his name, we see that he reacts very deeply, and if you call him promptly or powerfully by his name, then he turns with all of his whole atzmus. He immediately reacts in a very pointed and profound way when he hears his name mentioned. Well, that's a sign that even though the name is not him at all, because it's just a name, as the old saying has it, what's in a name? We're saying Nachanami, Avalidoki, so there's a kesher and a shaykhs between the name and the etem. So that's the point that they will taina that Lamaila, that's the moshel. That there's the pshitas of the atzmas, and then there's his name, with that, even though that's not him, it's only a ha ora mimenu kshu ein lo tchila vel zeh yesh lo tchila, but it's got a very close shaykhs with him in the sense that it represents the Eibusha, and through that he is mashpia and he carries out all of his inyonim with that shmoi. However, Haramak zal nechlak aleim. However, the Ramak, he differed with them. Behavi Rayas, and over there in the Sefer HaPardes, he brings proofs to show Sha'keser u'miklal es aspiras mamish shaheim mechudoshim. So he tainas that the Keser is also a mechudash. In other words, that the Keser is a yesh mi'ayin, mi'ayin tzei. Just that he's a very delicate madrega b'zeh. He's much higher and more withdrawn from the gilui to the lower oilamus than what the Esesphiras are. But b'hen Chanami, he's also a mechudash. I'm going to say here, the Keser is also a mechudash. So Lafi Devarov, it's got a certain point in the moshel of Keser. We pointed out that that's something which goes on the head of the king, and albeit it beautifies and elevates his head and the highest point in him, of a sof kasof, it is a dover kilo nibdo from the etzem koved of the king. It's like another Indian, as it was, a dover musuyam. The Indian in the Moshel saying that Keser is also a dover musuyam sheish b'zeh kli, also has a certain similarity and bears out the moshel of the crown. However, Shahin Mechudoshim Ela, as if it's Mechudoshim, then it's just like the other spirit. As in Cain, then it's Bechlau, not in our whole discussion, because we're looking for something which is Lamaila Mi'ah Spirit, and that's what we're calling Keser. The crown is Lamaila Mi'ah from the king. It may sit on him and may have a certain shaykhs to him, but it's higher than him, and it indicates this supernatural aspect of the king that makes him ruler over the whole land with the ganze pomp and splendor in the Keser. So therefore, if that's the case, then how is the Keser one of the Esesphiros? So therefore he says, Ela, the Tchilas Atzilas, Sheyeh Shaykh Loim Esphiros Mamish, V'hamizgala Eleinu, after the brackets, U'mina Chochma Ula Mat. So the Ramak says that the whole purpose of the union of the spheres is eventually to bring the Gilui down into the Oilamus. As one on that the spheres are like a mamutza between the Lamayla Mi'asfiras and the Olamas Bria Yetzirah Vasiyah. And therefore the word Sfira is from the word to relate and to tell, Lasaper. What Lasaper means, to take something on a higher madrega and give it over to the hearer. Yes. Or it can even be Lashon Sipur. What Sipur can mean to count. Yeah, the idea of Sefer, you count something. Can also Sfiras Ho'ima, it means that we count the Oima. But it also has in itself the concept of telling over, which is like we just saw, a gilui too. And the Indian of accounting is also a gilui, because our number is, as it were, hidden, and we reveal, by counting, we reveal the significance of the number. So therefore, says the Ramak, the whole Indian spheres per se, in their normal function, is that they are something which is Mizgale Eleinu. Now what he means Eleinu, he means us, but what he means is the Oilamus, and eventually the created Oilamus. And that's what he calls Tchilas Atzilus. So the Rebbe puts in brackets, the Ho Behor Talya, the one is dependent in the other. The Mashu Hu B'chinas Sphira B'Metzias, Mamela Hu B'chinas Mishkale. So here the Rebbe makes a very important point, both in the Klolos Havana of the Esesphiras and in this Indian of the Shitta of the Ramak. And that is, what is shayt to say that any Indian can reveal itself, and literally what we just touched, it can tell you over and tell you things about the Ein L'Saper. And to bring over and to be Megala, well, that's a function of the Spheres. If we're going to say that the Spheres are mamish kol in Elikut, and somehow or another there's a power in them to give over and reveal and tell you, then they're going to tell you what they really are. Then either you're going to just be bottled b'metzia from what you hear, or you're not going to be able to hear it b'klal. Yeah, like the famous in the Kasha what the Baal Shem Tov asked on what's written in Pirkei Avos, I think it's stuck at this week's Pirkei Avos. Well, the state, it's not really Pirkei Avos, it's only a Brisa. It's Pirkei Shishi, it's not really, it's a Mishnah Pirkei Avos, it's a Brisa. But Al Chapanim should know that every day there goes out these bas koils, you know, what they call them, heavenly voices from heaven. And the Baal Shem Tov says, well, what's the purpose of these bas koils going out? Nobody hears them. You don't walk around seeing all sorts of Yidden shuttling themselves saying, oh yeah, I just heard the bas koil right now. Yeah, nobody seems to hear the bas koil. You don't ever say, what's the purpose of the bas koil? So because we're not dealing with it in the class, we'll leave you with the kasha that you'll be able to body your heads and maybe try and work it out. What's the purpose of the bas koil? Nobody hears it. Anyway, suffice it to say that there's such a thing as there can be divine telling and divine things that we just not aware of them. They just don't reach us. So therefore, says the Ramak, if the spheres go over the etzem pshitas of the Ein Sof, and there's some power that the Eivshter made to just give over towards the lower Eilamas, the etzem minyan of Elikus, Kamei and nobody's going to hear it, and nobody will be able to hear it. And if he did hear it, he would become bottled b'metzia, just lose his metzia. And if says the Ramak, on that basis we have to say that the spheres are already a power of metzia. They've already undergone this immense change. That's what we call mechudoshim, that they've gone about, and even that they've already joined what you might call the tremendous fraternity of metzia. They've already become to a certain darga in Shomatia. And therefore they have the ability to take things in a certain way and tell it over to you, and they limit it and also carry it over and make it receivable to you. Why? Because you're a Matthias for sure. Never. So we're for sure a Matthias. And they, if they weren't, but this Matthias, they wouldn't be able to reach you. And therefore they're also a certain level of Matthias. And that's what we called them before in the name of the Aramukubal Mukhadashi. And the Ramak is not frightened by that term. He's not, as it were, how do you call it, disturbed by the fact that the spheres are in effect Mechudoshim, and that implies that they are a Metzius. They're already an entity, which we can call it an entity apart from the simplicity and the absolute unlimitedness of the Ein Sof. And therefore he said, since there are Metzias, therefore they're able to appear to you and be Mizkaleh to you and tell you over. Yafalosh and Sipur, like we pointed out, it's one of the Biurim in the word Sphere. And if I said the Rebbe, it's Ho Baho, Talia, it's dependent one in the idea. So therefore he said that most of the spheres, if not well close to all of them, have all become like that. They're all infant Metzias in the real sense, mamish, and therefore they're able to be miskaleh to all the lower oilames. And he said, "V'hu min ha-chokhmah ulamata." That's if we take chokhmah and bina, well, das was shiloh in this case, but we reckon it, chokhmah, ubina, and the midas, and so on. They all are things which are mitgaleh to the lower elements, which are called elenu. However, he said the Indian from keser, even though it's also a sort of a Metzias, but it's a Metzias dakova elyoina, that its sipur is not able to reach the Mekablim. In other words, even though it's also a Mechudash, but it's still in a withdrawn form, if not completely and utterly, but I'll upon him in a much higher state of relative withdrawal than what the other spirits are. And therefore, it's called not a Metzias Mizkaleh. He said, "Who min ha-chokhmah ulamata? Avo ha-keser hu b'chinas tachlis ha-helem legamrei." It's in a state of absolute hidingness, even according to the Shitta, legamrei, absolutely. Lefisha bekeser meya gilei oirein seif mamish. Olazeis ena b'chinas Metzius Mizkaleh. In other words, it's a Metzias, because he admits that it's also from the Mechudashim. But it's not a Metzias Mizkaleh. And why is that? Because the Oirein Seif, which even he admits is there's certain madregas which are called Ein Seif L'mayla Mi Etzem HaKeser. Well, that is Meya, and that appears in the Keser, and that's what makes it Ilui and elevated and withdrawn from all the others in a way that, albeit it's already a certain form of Metzias, but it's not a Metzias Mizkaleh, v'zehu ha'ilui shebekeser. Aval, the truth of the matter is, hu gam kein masher ne'atzal me'atzmus ha'ma-tzil. Nonetheless, he says, it is something which has been brought about from the very essence of the bringer about himself. Ma'atzil, it means the Eibishter, how he brings about the Esesphere. What that tends to imply, that there is a Madrega L'mayla me'akeser, which brings about these inyonim. And exactly what that is, according to the Ramak, we need to work out. And that's something which is in this Hemshech, the Rebbe is not really nichnas there, but there are Makimis incidents where we do go into that we try to figure out, since the Ramak doesn't seem to emphasize so much this whole idea of another madrega between the Atzmas and the Keser. I'm sorry, between the Atzmas and the Esespheres, which we call Keser, and that's like a separate madrega altogether. That's the Ein Sof, as it were, but he holds that, on the contrary, the Keser is one of the Esespheres. Is in Cain, what is this Atzmas HaMaitil according to him? Is it the Eibishter himself, or is it also another Darga? And if it is, why doesn't he call that Keser? Why does he insist that Keser is one of the Esespheres? So therefore, it seems that the Maskana, according to the Ramak, is a very interesting one, which we can't go into here, but it is dealt with in certain places in Chassidus. However, for our purposes, he holds that the Atzmus HaMa'atzil, the very essence of the Eibishter, whoever he or the very essence of the bringer about of the Esser spirit, well, that's the one that is Meya in the Mechudash, which is called Keser, and because there's a certain ha'ora or shining of that Madrega, which is Lamaila Mi Etzem Keser, into the Keser, then that's what makes it impossible to be Misaper or Megala to the lower Oilamas, but not because it is Mamish Amadrega Shalamaila Mi Aspiras Lagamri. But it's just a case of extreme relativity, according to the Ramak. In other words, it's only relatively higher, but it's relatively very higher. And therefore he calls it Ne'atzal mi'atzmus ha'ma'atzil. Now we notice that the expression here, Ne'atzal mi'atzmus ha'ma'atzil, he doesn't say that it's Mechudash mi Yesh mi'ayno, Mechudash mi'akadosh baruch hu v'chulu. He said it's Ne'atzal mi'etzem ha'ma'atzil. Now we need to appreciate why would the Rebbe alter the language slightly at the end of that sentence when we're talking about the Mokeh of the Madregas HaKeser, and calling it a Ne'atzal and not a Mechudash like he did earlier. So we have to say it's like this. The word Atzilus, Beklal, is an absolute noun from this word Ne'atzal. And the truth of the matter is that the word Atzilus is based on the word Eitzel. And the word Eitzel means near or Samuch. Something which is Samuch Elacha, you say Eitzel, say Etzli, you say Eitzel HaShulchan, okay, Eitzel, so meaning it's near and Korev. And you mean that it's near Korev in a way which is Be'erach. You don't mean it's incomparable, otherwise you wouldn't say it's Samuch or Eitzel. You would just say it's somewhere around, but who knows where. So therefore the Inif and Atzilus implies that something is near and korev. However, the very fact that I say that something is near and korev, and I use the expression that the source of that is a ma'atzil, which is like a causatory form of the word to make a ne'atzal happen, ma'atzil, well, that tends to imply that there's a certain entity in that thing which we call Atzilut. In other words, that if I relate to it and say it's near or far, or I can identify to it, then I mean that it has a certain state or metzias. But in this particular context, since we started off by saying that the Ramak is of the opinion that the Esser spheres are already Mechudoshim, but that's a strong word. That means they're already Mamish in the form of a Yesh, Mi'ayin. As Av Keser, the Rebbe says, maybe the Ramak wouldn't say it's Mamish Yesh Mi'ayin in the normal sense, like he does about Chochmah of Sharia spheres, but he would call it a Ne'atzal, meaning that it's come about in a way that is still very close to its shoyresh, even though bi'amiti sayin, and it's also a mechudash lagabi that shoyresh, of it's so more close than it is mechudash that we call it close rather than so in other words, we give it a higher name and a higher terminology, which indicates that it came about in a way that it wasn't really misrachek. It didn't really go a long way from its mokeh, and therefore we call it ne'atzal and not mechudash. Or b'chen l'chanami, the emes is that it is mechudash. And that's why I use the expression that it's ne'atzal mi'etzem ha'ma'atzil. Obviously, it's one of the Esser Sfiros. Well, we got the two opinions, and that's why we said, Im Kain, sorry, here in later Ramak, what is beyond Keser? Where do we go after we reach Keser? Who and what is the Ma'atzil? How does it actually, how does it actually work? So the emes is that we're going to see as we go along that it looks that one can taina that according to the Ramak, Eino Chanami, the Etzem HaMa'atzil is maybe the Eibshter himself. And that's going to be a big chiddush like the Ramak, that he holds that all of the things that happen in the whole Bria have a certain traced form of what we call Ilah V'Orel about them. And that's a big chiddush in the Ramak. According to Chassidus Chabad, Tzorachim B'zeh, Zelo Poshet, V'chuli, Ain't kind of because it'll sort of maybe come up as we go along.
I don't understand how he would explain Hu Ushmai. How you explain there's Hashem and Ushmai.
Yeah, very nice. In other words, that if he holds that the Kesses are one of the Esesphires, yeah, then how's it Shmoi? How's it the Inyan from Shmoi? Very nice. So first of all, we could say that since we just said that it's kol kach korevelo mitzad echad, even though it is a mechudash, then maybe we could say that he calls Shmoi. Understand that he would call Shmoi, but if he's going to title it's mechudash, then it's hard to say koidem shenivraha, yeah, koidem shenivraha oilam. So we'd have to say that maybe, according to the Ramah, two possibilities. That Einachanami, there is another Madrega, but we can't really call it another Darga like these other Mekubalim do, because it's Kolul B'Toicha Atzmus. It's called Kolul B'Toicha Atzmus, that we can't really call it another Madrega, but it's enough of another Madrega to be called Shmoi. You follow? And therefore he would learn that in Shmoi, there's what we call Shmoi Ha'atzmi or Shmoi Ha'godeh or other such lashonos that we see sometimes. In Shmoi, what they indicate that they're mamish identifiable with the Atzmi. But in Echanami, it's a difficulty.
So the Ramak doesn't recognize any of like Ak and Tohu and all this stuff? He doesn't.
Oh, sure he does, yeah. It doesn't recognize Ak?
You just said when you're talking about Keter right now, what Esther Spiro are you talking about? Within Atzilus or?
Yeah, well, here we are. So you asked what's with all these madrigas like Ach and Akudim and all those inyonim? That's a very good question. I must admit that that's quite a almost a mind-boggling question, that one. And the truth is, it appears in a Maimon of the Rebbe Rashab in another Hemshech, and the quite remarkable thing about certain of the Hemshechim of the Rebbe Rashab is that he touches on these questions where they only just appear maybe in other great Hemshechim of the Rebbeim, and he asks them sort of boom, that the Friedrich Rebbe said about the Rebbe Rashab that he was the Rambam of Chassidus, that he took the whole Chassidus and made it into a system. Like the Rambam took the whole Torah and made it into a whole system, and therefore, almost, with how do you call it, without Rahmanas, he asked all the questions. He asked all the questions. To use an expression, Kamur. So therefore, in certain of the Drushim, that appears that the Rebbe wants to say that maybe the Ramak doesn't hold the whole Inyan from Olam HaToyu. He doesn't hold that there was actually a daragim which we call Olam HaToyu, and maybe Mishum Zeh he wouldn't necessarily hold that these things like Adam Kadmon and other things which are mentioned in certain places in the Arizal, he doesn't necessarily hold that they're mamish madregas mesuyomis. He maybe holds that they were like things that if they were necessary, maybe they could have been called out, mashu me'ein zeh, but they're not madregas in the ein zeh. There may be things that he produced at a certain moment, l'tzadei zetzorah. And there's another great makubal called the Radvaz that he also holds. He writes that that's what he holds. Therefore, the Rebbe wants to suggest that maybe me'ein zeh the Ramak holds, or maybe since he was before the Arizal, and we don't find this whole inyan of these names like all the different spirits in Tuyu and that so clearly in many of the great original sources, and even in the Zohar Kodesh, you don't find about it tremendously clearly. You find it more tremendous arichas in the Kisvei Arizal. And we just pointed out the Arizal was after the Ramak. Therefore, some people, including the Rebbe Rashab, want to suggest that maybe the Ramak didn't hold but the whole inyan of Olam HaToyu as a whole part of what we call the Mareches Elokus. And so he didn't hold that between the Eibishter and our Olamas, there were all these different things called Toyu, and that they're all there, and that they're all the time functioning. The breakage, ask yourself the question, what's happening with the breakage? Did it finish, or did it start, or is it still going? and all that sort of thing. So these are all also questions which are asked, and so that involves us in the question. We say that all these things are really part of a huge system. The Ramak didn't hold that. That's what the Rebbe Rashab. He didn't hold that these things, and if they did occur, that they might have been one nuance at a certain point that the Eivishter did. For example, like he made the mabul. I mean, the mabul's not something that's going on the whole time. He made the mabul and then he stopped it. So they want to time that maybe that's what he did also with the Shviras HaKelim in Tehu, and maybe it was just a momentary thing that wasn't a madrega or really a gilui for the Ein Sof. That's what they want to time. And therefore, according to the Ramak, he learns that you got the simple atzmas, as you might say, and then Ein Nachram, you got Keser, and then you got the Esesfir. How's that going to work? Well, that's what we call Ilva Olu. That's what we call Ilva Olu, and that involves a whole other story. How does the Ramak say that? That seems to be says so certain other things that we hold as Chabadniks are pretty obvious, but that's because we're under certain simple, what you might call, impressions that we picked up in our Chassidus and in the works of the Arizal. But we have to remember that the Ramak didn't have all that in front of him, and therefore Lav Dafka that he was of those opinions. And there was another great Makubah called the Radvaz, but he was also a big, a tremendous koyach in Nigla, the Radvaz. And the amazing thing is that the Radvaz, he was the Arizal's Rebbe in Nigla. The Arizal learned Nigla from the Radvaz. But he doesn't hold it. When it comes to the Kabbalah, it's a completely different world. So we see that all these things are talui in different shittas, how they were makabel, and how they learned all the inyanim beruach hakodesh, kamura. Well, that's a very your question, I must say, is a very sort of mind-shaking question, because ein nachanami, it's right. Where are all these things according to the Ramak? And the answer is they're probably not there. That's the simple answer. All right, so now we go further, and we press ahead, and we say that the Ramak says that the Sfiras HaKeser is also Masha Ne'atzal, albeit Ne'atzal, not Mamish Mechudash, but it's one of the Eser Sfiras just on a much relatively higher madreg. V'yo Arizal, that he's after the Ramak, Be'et Chaim Shar Mem Aleph, Hichriya. The Arizal literally, what you might call, divided between the two. But he called Hichriya means he sort of swung the issue between the two opposing opinions. How do you say that? He resolved, or how do you use the expression? He resolved between them. Huh?
Mediate.
Yeah, mediated. Very nice. That's all. He mediated between them. Now this is an expression that we find in the Gemara. I mean, you guys will learn Perek Hakira. But are you still learning Perek Hakira, or did you stop? Huh? The third Perek in Shabbos.
Well, yeah,
Perek Hakira.
when I was there, they were still a middle.
Certain brachas now.
Huh?
Certain brachas now, they start.
You learn, everybody stopped learning Perek Hakira? You don't even know. I suppose you guys are not in the Gemara classes. Right? You're all budding Rabbonim Lach. Right? Anyway, whatever. It's over there in Perek Hakira. The Gemara brings a famous example of this, and that is that Rabbi Yochanan, I think it is, it says over there, that Kol Mokim Shata Moitei Shnayim Choilkim Ve'echad Machriya, then Halacha Kedivrei HaMachriya. This is Rabbi Yochanan. The wherever you'll find two Tanoim who differ, and then you find a third Tana that is what we call Machriya, then the halacha is according to the Divrei HaMachriya. So what does it mean? Two Shnaim Cholkim means you got two opinions, mamish, apparently almost opposite one to the other. One saying one thing, one saying almost what appears the opposite. And then you have a third opinion, which like finds a middle path between the two opposing. And therefore it says, on certain occasions I think we'll be able to hold according to this Tana. On other in Yonim and on other situations we'll be able to according to this Tana. It all depends on certain situations or statuses in the matter which will arise. And then if I create this new svara, which is not really a new svara, it's like a higher form of the two svaras together. I'll be able to sometimes hold that way, and sometimes I'll be able to say, yeah, maybe we can hold that way. So that's like a third opinion, but it's really like a colorless in a way of the other two. And so that's the famous union of Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferes. And we all know that Tiferes comes from a much higher Madrega, and therefore it's able to include sometimes in itself this one, include that one, and put the two opposites in such a way that they really don't always act as opposites, or they sometimes even unite together to form a new role, which is higher than the limited role that they represent, each on his own. And so that's why we say that it says the Alter Rebbe in many places brought down, also in Barov Makim and Sinsilas, that the halach is according to the Divrei HaMachriya, because he comes from the Madregas HaTiferes, which is a higher Madrega. It's what we call the Kaveh Emtsoi, the middle line, which takes in itself a higher koyach than either of the two more specific Madregas, Chesed or Gevura. So therefore the Arizal we see in Kabbalah in many cases. We're going to see here two cases now, we're going to move a bit further, where the Arizal with his greatness and his unbelievable Ruach HaKodesh, the Arizal was able to take different views of the Kabbalah which have been up to his time, and he was able to literally bring a third view which somehow or another settled the machlokes. It didn't completely belittle or finish off either of the two opinions, and it somehow or another created a new opinion which would help us bring in both of the other opinions to a certain extent at least. And that's what we call Achrua. So then we've got these two opinions now, the Shittas HaMekubalim HaRishonim, and we've got the Shitta of the Ramak. So the Arizal, he was Machriya. In other words, that he came up with a third line, which comes literally from a higher Madrega in understanding, almost, as we might say, and that's going to somehow or another cause us to give place to all opinions. So, Arizal, he says, Machriya, Da Keser Hu Mamutza. And he says, you've got one thing that neither of you people so far have come up with, and he says that the Keser is not just one Madrega. It's not just one Inyan. No, the Keser is a Mamutza. It's like what you might call a go-between Madrega. Dahainu, the Keser is really made up of two Madregas. And those two Madregas each relate to each of the two opinions, but they somehow come together and they form like a new Inyan, all united together. That's called the Inyan of the Keser itself. And he said the higher Inyan of the Keser, the higher Bechina in the Keser, that'll be like the Mekubalim HaRishonim more. And the lower level in the Keser, that'll be more like the Ramak. But the Keser itself is not that and not that. It's like a Bechina which is koilel in itself. Both of them. And that's the Inyan of the Halacha Kidurei HaMachriya, which you brought before in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And with that we'll see that really is, maybe I have to mention before some of you guys would, I'm pleased to notice that you are picking up some of the questions, that's going to raise the question, what actually joins these two levels together, and what actually makes them be able to sort of join together, live together if they're basically very different. And then we're going to see that really the Arizal said a third Madrega. He really wasn't talking about either of these two, he was really talking about a third. He was, but he wasn't. And that's like another wondrous concept which mamish links them together, because otherwise when you think about it very, very deeply, you can run into what you might call a third kasha. After you've got all the two sides worked out and everything, then you're going to ask, well, how are they one thing? They're like two separate entities. How are they really one thing? Anyway, suffice it to say, what the Arizal is out to do is to create a one entity. It's got two aspects to it, and that's the idea of a mamutza. And we see that when you need a go-between is when you've got two things that can't apparently come together, and you get a go-between that he's got a shaykhs to the top one, he's got a shaykhs to the bottom one, and he, as it were, brings the two of them together. And the famous marshal for that, I think we've given that on, certainly we had it earlier in the Hemshech, is the famous mashal. That is the concept of the Maturgaman. You remember this fellow that he's the translator of the Rav in the drasha of the Rav, and he stands in the middle between the Rav and the people, and he's not the Rav and he's not the people, but he's enough of the Rav to be able to understand enough of the amitias of the Rav in order to give it over to the people, but he's not mamish the people, because if he wouldn't be able to give them over the Divrei Rav, but he's got enough shaykhs to the people also to be able to bring it down and give it in there. So he's like a point. He's got a shaykhs there, he got a shaykhs there, and he brings the two together. He brings the Rav and the people together. So the same thing, the Rizal wants to say that that's what the Indian of the Kesser does. That you got this Indian of the Eibishter, how he is, Mamish Lamaila, Legamri me Spheres all together. And then you got the Indian of the Spheres. So between them, you've got this Indian of a thing called Akel. Well, that's a little bit like the Mukubalim or Shainim. But he said the Kesser itself divides itself into two madregas in order that it should be able to bridge over that gap between the Ein Sof and the Spheres. So he said it's got one aspect of it which is shy to the Ein Sof Yoter Bepshitas. That's what the had shot to the Mukubalim or Rishonim. However, he said it's also got a part in it where it's mamish a mokiv, a shoirish of the spheres in a real way that it's got a shot to the spheres. So in that way, it almost becomes like the Ramak. It's not mamish because the Ramak says mamish one of the Esser spheres. So the reason doesn't say it's mamish one of the Esser spheres, but he said it's close enough to be very close to the Esser sphere. So therefore, that's the shit of the Arizal. Yeah, Hichriya. Da Kesser hu memutza. V'yesh boi mibchinas tachtoina shebama'atzil. It's got the lowest aspect of the ma'atzil, of that level which brings about the Esser spheres. V'nikra mitzad b'china zu ein tzei. And in the Chanam we call it mitzad zeh adiyini van ein tzei. Why? Because it's the ma'atzil. It's not any of the spheres or even a mocket to them, mamish. It's a ma'atzil. Yeah, it's the Eibishter is beyond the spheres, and in that kufa, it's what he calls a b'china tach toina sheba ma'atzil. And he said that's the Indian van ein say. V'yesh boi mibchina shoirish ha'ne'atzalim. It's also got a direct shoirish to all of the ne'atzalim, which are all the Esser spheres. Yeah, therefore, it's got also a shaykhs and a kesser to Chochmah and Bina and Das and all the spheres. In other words, there's a level within Kesser where they're all there, they're just on a slightly higher state. And therefore, it's also got in itself the Shitta of the Ramak that it's very close to being part of the Esser sphere, even though it's not mamish, but it's very close to being a mokke opponent to the Esser sphere. Umitzad b'china zu hu b'minyan ha'Esser. Mitzad that b'china, it's b'minyan ha'Esser sphere. I mean, even though to a certain extent it's not mamish, but we can taina that maybe it is your, because like we saw that if the Ramak counts the Indian of Kesser in the Esser spheres, then Das has to move out, because you can't have both Das and Kesser, then you'll have 11. Yeah. So therefore the Indian for Das has to move out. So if we say that Das moves out, then that means that to a certain extent something moves in, bimkoimoi. Therefore, we have to say that this Madrega Tatoina in the Mamutza is so close and so part of Atzilus that it's considered being B'minyan as a sphere. In other words, that there's a form of Chitzoinius of that Madrega which Mamish is Meir into Atzilus. V'gam, Dvorov Tzrich Oshem. So the Arizal says in Cain, I've got the Indian that it's Lamaila Mi'as Spirits. Yeah, and that's called Ein Sof, but it's also Shayat to the Esser spheres, and even to a certain extent, it's B'minyanam, Mitzad it's Chitzoinius, it's B'minyanam of the Esser spheres. As in Cain, it's like almost what the Direi Mukubalim or Rishonim meant, almost what the Rama. Remember, I've brought the two together, as it were.
So what happens to Das?
Huh?
So what happens to Das?
Yeah, what happens to Das is, it's like the old saying, But if you got Mosayim, you have Mona. You understand? If you got Keser already in the Yesod Spirit, or Chaponim, the Chitonius of Keser being Meir, Mamish into the Yesod Spirit, that is Kilo counted together with them, then you got everything that Das will do for you. Because the Oini von Das is like his Kashas, Lamailami, Inyan Amachias, more than Inyan from Mahus, etc. etc. So if the Keser itself is Meir there, then that just happens automatically. In other words, that has a very profound Mahustic effect on all the spirits that they become, as it were, Oila Makusha in the Ein Sof. Well, that's a function of that. So, says the Rebbe, you guys are informed tonight. I'm very pleased to see it. So, Rebbe, says the Rebbe, that V'gam dvorov tzrichim biur. He said, even though the results is a very brilliant thing, and it seems to, in some way or another, join the different shittas together, even albeit the slight little differences, as we point out, it's not mamish literally that lower bechina of the Keser is mamish part of the Yesod Spirit, but it is. It's enough for the chitzonius of it to be already counted in the Yesod Spirit. Lefi shittas haramak. Irachim came, says the Rebbe, it's good. However, the word of Gam came tzrichim, V'gam the word of tzrichim biur. Also, the results words need further explanation. And here we see in Siddur, that you don't believe anybody. You don't just take anything as finished, no matter how wondrous it may sound. That you've got to work it out according to the power of Svara in the divine way that Siddur deals with Svara. And therefore we see that even the words of the Arizal, he heard everything from Eliyahu, Novi Chemuvin, Kriyadua, Gemavur, in the Kisvei Arizal itself. Nonetheless, if he says something, it has to stand in the test of our analytical view of things according to the divine analysis power that was given in Siddur. So therefore he said, even the words of the Arizal need biur. The Eich Shaykh Loima Sheish Boy Mibchinas Ein Sof Mamish. How can you say that in this Mamutza there's Mamish Inyan from Ein Sof, Kivan She'ein Keser Ein Sof? Since the Keser is not the Ein Sof, how can you say that the Ein Sof is Mamish inside the Keser? Im Kain Ein Sof, who Sevi, Atzmusay, Eich Shaykh. She bekesser mibchinas zu. So therefore he said, if you're going to say that the inyan from the Ein Sof is inside the keser, then he said, since Sof you're saying that the keser is not mamish the Ein Sof, Edachim Kain, that'll follow that you're taining that Ein Sof lagavi the keser is muhusi v'atzmusi, that which is already beyond, and I shayach sheyeh bekeser bechina. So how is it shy to say in keser such a thing? The whole thing is that we're trying to come down and make like a middle point between the two. And the Arizal said that in the higher madrega of the mamutza, the middle point of the two joining aspects of the middle point, he says you got bechina tachtoina shebama Tzio, and Ma'atzil means the Ein Sof, Mamish. So how can you say that the Ein Sof is Mamish Meir in the inyan of Keser? Then Im Kain, it follows that Keser is Mamish the Ein Sof. And how can you say that you've got a bechina of that in the inyan of Keser? Dehine, he said, apart is firaloi, shekesu bechlal beginas netzal vi'olul me'ein Sof. Ve'im kein masha ein Sof meir ba'keser, harihu beginas ha'orelevat. So he said, Mela, according to the parties, we can maybe say that he would be miyash of that problem, because he said, now here we notice that the Rebbe uses the expression, Dehine aparis firleisha akesa beklal ubchinas netzal va'olul mi ein Sof. Now notice here the expression alul. Now that alul is the second link word in the phrase ilava alul. And ilava alul is another whole series of concepts which add up to what we call gradated ishtalshalas. So if we're going to say that a keser is a alul from the Ein Sof, then we run into all sorts of problems. How can you say from something which is mamish Ein Sof an alul? Because an alul is like a specific madrega which comes out of something which is also specific, because it's called ishtalshalas, and ishtalshalas mean limited and interrelatable madregas. So how can you say that the keser is a alul from the Ein Sof? Yeah, that's a problem. That's in effect ultimately what the Ramak really said. And therefore the Rebbe threw that in for good measure, the expression olu. In other words, that the Ramak says that the whole Indian of the keser is only a ne'etzal va'alul, meaning it's only a limited, specific almost entity which has come from the Ein Sof. And like we said before, when Michal asked his question, we don't really know. It's hard to know, according to the Ramak, exactly how that happens. And particularly we call it alul, but this is how do you call it, strange? Oh, but that's what he holds, the Ramak. And therefore, if we're going to say that the whole Indian of the keser is only an alul, it's only like a specific, almost ishtalshalas, mamish from the Ein Sof, as in Cain, it can only be a ha'ora levad. It can only mamish be a, how do you call it, a luminescence and a shining, how do you call it, a ha'ora, reflection of the divine light, yeah. And a ha'ora can only be somehow or other toned down. It can be mitzumtzum. It can undergo different gradations. Yeah, ki kol gilui hu b'chinas ha'ora levad, lo b'chinas ha'atzmas, ki im ma shemeya me'orei b'ha'olu mimenu. Now it's very interesting that I was looking at a text earlier in the they've got certain texts of the what do you call it, the Samavov, where this whole lashon doesn't, a whole piece of this lashon doesn't occur. So it's interesting that there's some sort of difference of opinions here between what was actually it would appear what was actually the lashon in the Samavov itself. So therefore I'm reading it, we're doing it with here like it is in our Sefer, so therefore I'm reading it forward. But according to certain Gersois or certain new printings, that they take part of this whole, it doesn't appear, this whole lashon in certain places. So that adds to the small difficulties we have below. So I'm doing with it the way it's written here. So therefore they say that according to the parties, since the whole Indian from keser is all Ein Sof, well, that's difficult to say, but that's what he says, and therefore we can say that the oil which is meir in the Indian of keser is only a ha'ora bilvad, and then the Rebbe puts in ki kol gilui hu b'chinas ha'ora levad v'loi b'chinas ha'atzmas, and therefore we'll be able to say ki im ma shemeir me'ora b'ha'olol mimenu. V'liyesh zeu gilui b'chinas ha'er de Ein Sof mamish l'zeis ha'keser u'beteches ha'helem kanal. So here we see that according to this lesson here in the Samavov, they're trying to show how the Ramak, as it were, also dances on two chasanas. Dahainu, he's saying that the keser is really only a olul, and it's only b'derech ne'etzal va'olul, and therefore that's for sure that the Ein Sof, which is meir in keser, even b'kol shleimus shel keser, is only a ha'ora. If it's only a ha'ora, then a ha'ora means a limited thing, and that's the whole concept of ila va'alul. What this is going with the Ramak goes with that approach, that we see that when the ila gives rise to its alul, then it's only a ha'ora from the ila that causes the alul to come about. For example, we have ila va'alul, we have an example, moichin and midas, for example, that the moichin are ila and the midas are alul mimenu. So what is meir into the midas is only a ha'ora bilvad from the moichin, even though the midas come from the moichin and they carry in themselves the message of the moichin, or what actually goes out into the moichin is only a ha'ora bilvad from the way the moichin understand it. So similarly, the Ramak will tell you that which is mamish meir is only a ha'ora bilvad. Bilvad, because he says that wherever you talk about Gilui to a Makabel, then you've already gone down from your own Madrega. In other words, if you're going to reveal something to somebody, then you don't give him what you actually have. If you're an emissar, Baal Seichel, or an emissar Baal Ashpah. Because if you did, then he would be completely misbalbel. However, what you give him and what the oral receive, or what the Ila gives to the oral, is always a ha'ora bilvad b'derech tzimtzum v'ha'ora bil in the form of a limited luminescence. And that's what we call Gilui. The whole concept of Gilui, and so it's built around that idea. Because the whole idea of Gilui is where some Madrega which has a thing, and has it mitzad etzem, is trying to give it over to a receiver who's underneath it. And therefore, it can't give it exactly how it has it, and therefore it has to give it in the form of a luminescence, or a ha'ora. And so therefore, anything which has gone in, according to the Ramak, into the Kesser is only a ha'ora bilvad, and that's what we call the inyan from Gilui. However, he said, on the other hand, however, on the other hand, that is a Gilui which come from the Ein Seif, albeit it's come in the form of a limited ha'ora and a luminescence. Of a sof, it's a Gilui from the Ein Seif. Therefore, a Kesser who betachlis ha'helem, like he said before, on the one hand, it's part of the Esser spirits, and yet on the other hand, legabi all the other Esser spirits, it's a state of helem and withdrawal. But it's only a relative withdrawal, because ultimately speaking, it's part of the Esser spirits, because the Oyer Ein Seif, which is Meir, is only a very, very limited ha'ora bil. So we see that the Ramak also dances on two chasnas. On the one hand, he says that what is Meir from this state which he would call the Ein Seif, that which is Meir from that is only ha'ora bilvad. Oh, that makes it still high enough to be mudal from all the other spirits, but it puts them nonetheless amongst them. However, the Rizal says, the Bechinas Elyoinoi Shebekeser, the Eino Bechinas Atik, who Bechinas Taktoina Shebe'ein Tzei. The Rizal said that the Keser has got two Madregas in it, and he said the first Madrega is what we call Bechina Taktoina Shebe'ein Tzei. Now these two Madregas are called in other places all over in the city, you have to get used to that. They're what's called Atik Ari. What Atik means something which is withdrawn and nivdal, and Arich means it's already got a certain shyness to those things which are coming out of it. What Arik means like long faces, literally. Arich Anpin, it's called, long faces, and Atik means withdrawn. Ne'atak v'nivdal. So the Arizal says that Atik, he called that already Bechina Taktoino Sheba Ma'atzil. And we are calling the Matzil Ein Seif. But im noima do Ein Seif, who Bchinas Atzmas, if we'll say that the Ein Seif is mamish the inyan for Atzmas, eich shayach the Bekesa yeh Bchinas zu. How is a child that in this Madrega, which is called a Mamutza, how could you possibly have a inyan for Atzmas in that which is already becoming the go-between towards the Makablim? So you can't possibly say that that's mamish the inyan von atzmas. Void, and furthermore, eich shayach ba'atzmas mamish loima b'chinas taktoino oel. How is a child to say either the expression taktoino oel? In other words, if he's tying the result in his first level of the mamutza, he's tying that's atzmas mamish. That's Atzmas Ein Seif, then how can you say that that's in the Inyan von Kesser, which is already a Mamutza, that's already going down to the Makabla. And furthermore, how can you say in Atzmas Elyoina Oi Tak Toina, how can you say a Bechina Tak Toina of the Atzmas is found in the Kesser? Elamai, we have to say that the Bavadai, the Kesser is not Atzmas or Ein Seif, it must be another Bechina, and there's Lamaila Mi Etzem HaKesser, there's a Madrega which we call Ein Ain't safe. According to the Arizal, it's going to be good that the Indian of the Kesser is not mamish the Ein Safe. However, it's not going to be good, or it's going to be Doira Shabiu. What does it mean, the Bechina Taktoina of that Madrega? What does it mean that Kilo is Elyoina Taktoina in this Madrega? That's what we're going to have to work out. And that's what he says. That he goes on to say that according to the Ramach, we'll have to say that ain't safe is Mamish a name for the Atzmas, and we'll see about that in more and in developing future and coming episodes. Suffice it to say that the Rizal has taken us into a new concept, which at first glance looks as if it's a wonderful idea. It sort of made the two Kabbalim Rishonim and the Ramach, fit them into two levels, brought them together somewhat. But the Rebbe said, however, when you look carefully, how do you get around this idea that he calls the Bechina Elyoina, Atik, he calls the Bechina Taktoina, Sheba Ein Safe. If it's Mamish Ain't Safe, how can you have a Bechina Taktoina? And if it's Mamish Ain't Safe, what's it doing in a Madrega, which is to be Mechaber the how do you call it, the Makablim and the Oilamas with the Ein Safe. So there we are. That's where we're holding at the moment. The Arizal apparently did an amazing thing, but on the other hand, his Lashenis and the things that he tinus are not borrowed. So we'll see more about that, Be'ez Hashem, in further and developing episodes for doing in further inyonim, further shiur.